the way in which science is incorporated into policy is a more complex issue than meets the eye. And at least three questions that need to be asked. The first is, does science have any privileged place in relationship to other knowledge-based systems in policy formation? Does science have a privileged place? The second is, how does the changing nature of science affect the way in which you answer that first question, and in particular, how the way in which science advice is actually provided? And thirdly, you come to a practical aspect which, given those first two questions are answered, how do you actually incorporate scientific advice into a policy and political framework? Now, I'm going to focus on those three questions, although you can't entirely separate them. So in the way I talk to you, there'll be somewhat of interplay between those first three questions. Now, I think at the start, I'm going to make an assumption, which I think is a reasonable one, that democratic societies make decisions in policy on many inputs, but underlying it all is the question of what kind of decisions the governments want to make. And I think we can assume that while modern social democratic governments, subject to staying within the ideological frameworks of the parties in power, the governments do really want to make good decisions. I think if you don't have that as a basis, you can't have any faith in the democratic process. But the issue is, how do I make the decisions? And my view is quite clear, to put it quite simply, that the use of high-quality information and evidence should be at the core of decision-making processes, and that decisions made in the absence of informed background material are by definition made on the basis of dogma and belief, and therefore less likely to be effective and efficient, and have the danger, as we'll talk about later on, of entrenching policies which can be actually harmful or of little value. In making that statement of my own personal position, I'm really making a statement about the positioning of scientific knowledge. Now, what I'm going to argue, and it's really getting beyond the postmodernist perspective, and argue that we can accept that science, as we understand it, is somewhat different to other forms of knowledge. That it's the only process we have to build reliable knowledge about the natural and built world. And that other than that, the only real other source of knowledge we really have are those effectively of experience, belief, or dogma. And how one gains experience is, of course, influenced by what kind of process was used in getting there. This is an important, if not essential, point, for the particular authority of science is intimately associated with the particular nature of science. And that's really a key point. What is science? I would suggest to you that science is not a series of facts, it's not a series of statements of fact. It's actually a process by which how those facts are obtained. And that's what defines ultimately science is a process underlying. It's not my view, it's the view which a number of philosophers of science have come about. I'm going to expand particularly on this as this talk evolves, but for the moment, let's just stick with the traditional Baconian Purpurian view of what science is. Now, I always find it funny that Bacon is associated with this, because Bacon himself never did a scientific experiment. His life never became anywhere close to doing a scientific experiment. But we've come to view science in that model as an iterative process of experiment and observation, hypothesis testing, reformation of hypotheses, new experiments, and in some way, at some point, the knowledge appears to be seen, considered as reliable and accepted as a statement of what we know. The key point is that science in that model is not the facts themselves, and science is the process. Science is a process by which, as Jonathan Marx, the philosopher, pointed out, by which we make our best efforts to understand what's going on in the universe, in the natural and social world, and in ourselves. And to think scientifically, there are a number of tools. Ideas about cause and effect, respect for evidence and logical coherence, curiosity, intellectual honesty, the willingness to create hypotheses, the willingness to discard ideas in the face of evidence. They are the core skills of the scientific process and of scientists. Now that is the traditional, simple model of what I would call linear science, the kind of science that most people think science is. The kind of science that leads you to know what the speed of light is, the kind of science that leads you to conclude that birds are descended from dinosaurs, etc., etc., etc. Now, the issue is, if we even accept that point, how would you incorporate, why would I argue that science might have a privileged place in policy formation as opposed to other sources of knowledge? And the best way I might use to explain that might be an example. The other sources of knowledge are those really of intuition, belief and dogma. And there's examples abound of the different impacts of decisions made on belief, intuition or dogma. Now, an example that comes from the 1980s is perhaps the most dramatic. It would sound intuitively commonsensical that formal driver education would be a good thing. That teaching young people to drive within a formal pedagogical framework at school would reduce the rate of road accidents. And in the 1980s, literally billions of dollars were spent in the Western world, particularly in North America, but also in New Zealand, Australia and in Europe, on putting formal driver education into the high school programs. Mothers Against Drunk Driving said, got to do that, reduce the incidence of young people killing themselves or injuring themselves. The insurance companies wanted it. Everybody said, that's common sense, let's do it. A few scientists said, don't do it, and they were ignored or vilified. In fact, someone would give a rather rough treatment before the US Senate. But they insisted that doing it was not the right thing to do. Well, driver education came in, billions of dollars were spent. The scientists kept saying it's going to make matters worse. The social scientists, their data was ignored until the 1980s, because of a financial crisis in a number of United States, the educational systems there stopped doing driver education because they couldn't afford it. And the rate of road accidents started to fall quite dramatically, and injuries and death rates in adolescents fell quite dramatically. Finally, the proper studies were done and demonstrated that indeed, where driver education was formalised at school, road accident rates for adolescents went up, the injury rate went up, and so forth. Now, what had gone on was quite obvious in retrospect. If you install driver education, then pressure is put on by young people and their parents to let them get a driver's license at a younger age, because everybody's doing it. And the younger people get their driver's license, great, there's a linear relationship, inverse relationship between the age at which you get a driver's license and your likelihood of having a prank. Secondly, if you had the people who went through those programs actually were more overconfident and drove in a more overconfident way than people who have not been through those programs. Now that's a classic example of where common sense says it's logical to put in driver education. The scientists said it may not be logical, test it first. And common sense was overruled by scientific empirical data. We have many other examples. Well, another one which is in a very similar domain is drug and alcohol education at high school. Common sense, drug and alcohol education works. Does it? The most commonly used program until it was banned by the United States Department of Education was DARE, drug and alcohol, whatever it is, education. It was shown definitively when it was properly assessed that it increased the use of drug and alcohol by young people, not reduced the incidence of drug and alcohol use by young people. We still have it, believe it or not, in some places in New Zealand. Can't believe it, but we do. And if we go further and just think about this further, if you don't know what's going on, if you don't monitor what you do, you can't make rational decisions about programs. So, if you look at the OECD report on adolescents and young people in New Zealand, in the OECD country, came out I think 2009, they make a statement about New Zealand which points out that New Zealand spends considerable amounts on single parent benefits which last until the children are late in their teenage years, with the notion that this promotes child well-being. There is an international consensus that there's little or no evidence that these benefits positively benefit child well-being. And of course, this is a reference to domestic services benefit. Its argument when it was introduced was that we have to give solo parent families a benefit for the benefit of the child. And we maintain it until the youngest child, I think, is 16. Around the world, there are many solo parent benefits used, but in general, with the exception of New Zealand and I think Australia, they usually stop when the youngest child is 5. And there's a $200 million difference per annum between in New Zealand stopping it at 5 and stopping it at 16. Now, the OECD might be right, or the OECD might be wrong. We just don't know, because nobody's ever done the research. We do not know whether sustaining in New Zealand, in the context of the families who receive support in New Zealand, whether a prolonged child benefit is a good or a bad thing. There are arguments why it might be a good thing. There are equally arguments why it might be a very bad thing. It might be delaying the mother getting back in the workforce, developing her self-identity and self-esteem, because the child is sense of recurrent dependency and so forth. Equally, there are arguments that some people won't make it's a good thing. But the problem is, nobody knows. But because it's common sense says it must be a good thing, governments are stuck with spending several $100 million, which may or may not need to be spent, but there's now no way to evaluate it. There's now no way, late in the piece, to collect the data to know whether maintaining it was a good or a bad thing. And so that's an argument which says governments get trapped by not having information about the programs they implement. And through and through and through, you keep finding that governments invest a lot of money in programs which have dogma and belief driving them, and nobody knows whether they work or not. But once they're started, they're politically impossible to stop. I suspect there's literally billions of dollars spent each year in programs in New Zealand which, if they were evaluated properly, nobody would have ever invested